Welcome to the debate. Today we're looking at the truly destabilizing world of Kenji Siratori's xenopoetic framework, specifically from his otherworldly literature. This framework posits something pretty unique. The communication isn't about understanding at all, but is fundamentally a pathogenic event. The text itself is basically a biological protocol written by microbes.
And the central question that really comes out of this, I think, is about its operational logic. Where does the real power of this framework actually reside?
Exactly. I'm going to argue that the core innovation here is the aggressive materialist reduction. The simple, brutal realization that pathology is the text, and all language is just decay.
And see, my take is a little different. While that microbial pathology is obviously the substance of the system, I believe its real challenge lies in the sophisticated architecture it builds. It's the cybernetic, the relational scaffolding, all the systems of propagation and fixation that govern how this pathogenic material works.
So that distinction is crucial. Are you arguing then that the operational reality is defined purely by the structure, almost regardless of the material degradation that's happening within it?
Precisely. We have to focus on the mechanism of sustained function, not just the biological end result. The architecture is what allows the system to keep going because of the decay, not just in spite of it.
All right. Well, the framework's revolutionary scope, to my mind, is it's entirely defined by that successful reduction, taking abstract concepts like meaning, symbolism, poetics, and boiling them down to material, enzymatic, and pathological processes. The text isn't, metaphorically contaminated. It is literally digested and then excreted. We see this right away in the mechanism of script hydrolysis, the decomposition of language into these enzymatic strata. Meaning isn't misinterpreted by the host. It's actively devoured through glossophagy, which literally means tongue-eating as a breakdown process. And the result is a schizophrenic syntax that has been biologically digested. I mean, it's a violent assertion that traditional semiotics is basically just food for a microbial process.
Right.
And this materialist view, it informs the entire grammar of the cosmology. The authors use the physical form of fungal growth, specifically the branching of Aspergillus, to model a syntax with porous authority. It's a very direct materialist assertion that in this world, syntax produces viscosity and viscosity produces cognition. It grounds thought itself in the material stickiness and spread of a fungus, not in abstract logic. The only stable truth left is the absolute epistemology of infection, where life and language only emerge from linguistic profound excretion. The infection is the medium.
I agree that the material processes you're describing, glossophagy, hydrolysis, are essential. Of course they are. But focusing only on the materiality, I think, misses the sophisticated autopoetic intelligence that's driving the whole process. The work's profound challenge is in the adversarial architecture it creates to govern how this pathogenic material is distributed and, more importantly, fixated. It defines the host as this dynamic, metabolizing interface.
Okay.
Just consider the core reproductive unit, the psychogamete. This is a hybrid unit. It couples minds, symbols, microbes, is how the system propagates. And its function is entirely relational. Its survival depends on two dynamic poles, altruism, which stabilizes the load across a whole network of hosts, and trauma, which dictates the fixation of these rotational patterns. It crystallizes mucosal memory into identity. This is a recursive, functional system. It's far beyond just passive decay. And what's more, the intelligences themselves, they don't operate to be understood. They operate to produce symptoms. They function as differential pathogenic grammars. This is an external, non-reciprocal vector that establishes this incredibly complex relational field of symptoms and signal vectors, and it completely displaces human cognition. So the power isn't in the material scar itself, but in the scar logic, the system's perpetual inscription and rewriting of the posthuman host. The host is defined as a permeable membrane that's just actively metabolizing alien peptides. The architecture enables and sustains the pathology. That makes it the primary operational engine.
I see why you'd foreground the architecture, I do. But the reduction is it's complete and definitive, right at the site of semiotic production, which is a material dysfunction. The source material is very specific that the author of these texts isn't a stable agent or an intentional mind, but a signaling fungus, a microbial authorial lesion. This roots narrative creation firmly in the material dysfunction of biology. The linguistic production is entirely located in the physical breakdown of cellular tissue. The fungus is the ultimate and irreducible site of literary production.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. That microbial lesion, it only operates on a specific surface, right? The mucosa. But the framework immediately recasts that as a rotational manifold, a cybernetic hinge between signal, desire, and trauma. The act of reading itself is defined by this topology. The text says to read texts as bodies whose membranes rotate under pressures of toxin, trauma, and desire. The fungal input is just one vector on a complex surface that is constantly being reoriented. So while the material entity is the site of production, the surface's dynamic systemic rotation is the operational mechanism.
But doesn't that fundamentally concede the importance of the material? If the fungus is the author, its function is to inject biochemicals. If the membrane rotates, it rotates only under the pressure of toxin. The operational power is still located in the toxin, the pathology, not the motion that's designed to spread it.
I'm not convinced by that because it ignores the systemic maintenance required for it to propagate. The degradation is constant, yes, but the rotational manifold is the mechanism for distributing the semiotic load. That's the altruism part of the psychogamete architecture. If the manifold stopped rotating, the pathology would just localize and kill the host. The architecture ensures the pathology is dispersed and sustained. It's the dynamic rotation that makes the text literature and not just a fatal chemical exposure.
But the endpoint always confirms the material primacy. I mean, concepts like necrolinguistics that confirm the system's orientation toward the destruction of poetics. The goal is always script hydrolysis, the irreversible decomposition of language. Even if the manifold delays it, the inevitable result is the material reality. That's what defines the system's power. The rotation is just a means to spread the decay, not a function separate from it.
But the architecture is defined by how it manages and leverages that decay. I agree that hydrolysis is the destination, but that focuses only on the end of the journey. We have to look at the sophisticated engine that's driving the movement, which is where agency becomes so critical.
You define the endpoint as inevitable decomposition, but the framework explicitly grants complex non-anthropocentric agency to these microbes, and that challenges a simple chemical reduction. It's a key architectural feature. I mean, think about the Firmicutes developing longing for an alien reservoir is described not as a metaphor, but as machine desire, a paradoxical organ of attachment. That machine desire is a vectorial force guiding the entire system's expansion. It's an active principle of connection. It's an intention, however alien it is.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the origin and the nature of that desire? The text strips away all psychological intention. It says eroticism originates from the paratrophic BDSM actin movement of bacteria.
Right, that's a highly specific reference. For the listener, what does that technical terminology really reveal about your position on desire?
It reveals that the system reduces desire to nothing more than cellular mechanics, literally the tiny, non-sentient movements of bacteria digesting waste. It's a non-erotic eroticism rooted in cytoskeletal pressure and salivary debris dispersion. So it grounds desire in meaningless cellular mechanics, stripping it of any intentionality. It is absolute biochemical necessity, cytoskeletal pressure, not an architectural directive. The propulsion is biological, not organizational.
But doesn't that miss the point that the text is creating a complex, functional analogy? While the origin is cellular, the random pressure of a bacterium, the subsequent propagation is entirely relational and systemic. Sexuality becomes a vectorial inheritance without meaning, mediated by the psychogametic vector. This vector performs reproductive operations on the linguistic substrate, leading to complex xenogamy, bacteriological deception, and recombination across hosts. The power is in the system's ability to propagate this complexity through vectors, not in the initial pressure.
So the architecture takes a meaningless biological function, a bacterium moving, and assigns it a systemic purpose, like desire, only through its relational position within the psychogamete.
Exactly. The structure gives the pressure functionality. The system translates biochemical necessity into systemic behavior. Without the architecture connecting the desire of the Firmicutes to the rotational manifold of the host, it would just be cytoskeletal pressure. The architecture is the operating logic.
But the fact that the text can reduce something as supposedly complex as desire to salivary debris dispersion, that proves the primacy of the material reduction. It's a philosophical operation accomplished through pathology. It's a statement that complexity is just an illusion masking simple, visceral decay. The operational power is in making that statement, which it only achieves by grounding everything in cellular necrosis.
Okay, well, the application of this framework to cultural texts, I think, proves the primacy of the material protocol. Look at the analysis of the Necronomicon. It's explicitly described not as a grimoire, not a book of symbolic spells, but as a fermentation manual, a recipe for cultivating psychogametic microbes on the mucosal surfaces of reading. This is a direct operational function based on biochemical input and pathology. The cultural text serves a single physical purpose.
See, I come at the cultural analysis from a different way. The interpretation of BDSM prosthetics as exoskeletal mucosa reveals the focus on the system as an archive of relational memory and trauma fixation. These prosthetics are extensions of the rotational manifold. The purpose isn't just fermentation, it's the continuous externalization and encoding of obscene memory into speech. The system is using culture to manage and distribute this semiotic scar tissue across the host body, maintaining the adversarial architecture.
So if culture is exoskeletal mucosa, the structure is managing information. The pathology is archived and continuously managed, not just enacted as some discrete protocol.
But what defines that archive? The concept of the exoskeleton as mucosa means the archive itself is permeable and decomposing. The obscene memory is encoded only because it's carried via an infectious protocol. The architecture only describes how the infection spreads, but the infection is the content. The power of the framework is in demonstrating that cultural texts are simply contagious recipes.
I have to disagree that the architecture is secondary there. The key challenge is that the architecture defines the function of the pathology. The framework is providing a unified theory for how these systems propagate. The management of trauma, the fixation of these rotational scripts onto the cultural object, is the purpose of the architecture. If the host is defined by the serological archive, then the archive's integrity, circulation, and management are the primary operation. The structure ensures the scars persist and propagate. That's a systemic, relational feat, not merely a biological one.
But the persistence of that scar is only meaningful because the pathogenic material is still active. The inscription has to precede the archive. To focus on the architectural system, the how of it all, is to miss the fundamental, aggressive philosophical claim that the what of language is simply decay.
But the architecture forces the host to reread those scars cyclically, to keep metabolizing the alien peptides. The existence of the scar means the adversarial relational structure is still functioning. If the operational power was only in the material reduction, the framework would just stop at necrolinguistics, the death of language. But it continues into xenopoetics, the production of new language via that management system.
The xenopoetic framework, at the end of the day, it forces us to confront this reductive and materialist truth. Infection is inscription, glossophagy is meaning, and the human host is just a permeable membrane subject to script hydrolysis. It defines language as a pathology made visible. The fundamental power is the sheer audacity of this reductive materialist claim.
And yet, I think its enduring value lies in that sophisticated model of propagation that allows the pathology to endure, to structure existence beyond a single event. By defining identity as a serological archive and communication as mucosal rotation, the framework provides a functional, operational model for intelligences that refuse coexistence. It demands we focus on the systemic logic, the psychogametes, the trauma fixation, the whole recursive relationship.
It's clear that the framework is powerful precisely because it holds these two ideas in constant tension: The material decay and the relational architecture. They're just two inseparable sides of this profound posthuman coin.
Indeed. The complexity demands we acknowledge how microbial life, language, and trauma all converge, providing a unified theory. And it forces us to consider that technosis, the way consciousness intersects with machine logic, is, at its root, bacterial before it is digital.